They told me no one would ever come looking for a girl like me. They told me the forest would keep my screams. They were wrong about both.
My name is Elena, and before the frost came that winter, I had killed 12 of the 15 men who took me. This is how I found the other 3.
Long before kingdoms drew their borders in ink and treaty, there was a valley called Thornwood, where the wheat grew tall and the rivers ran clean, and where a girl named Elena lived a life so ordinary that no bard would have thought to sing of it. She was 20 years old. She had her mother's stubborn jaw and her father's patience with animals, and on the morning this story begins, she was walking home from the market with a basket of onions and no idea that her life, as she understood it, had only hours left to exist. 900 years later, historians would still argue over whether what she became afterward was justice or something else entirely. But to understand the ending, you first have to understand the girl she was before the men of the Ashen Company ever rode into Thornwood Vale. 15 men rode into that valley before the harvest moon. By the following autumn, only 3 of them would still be alive. Only 1 would still be alive after that. Who were they? What did they want with a farmer's daughter who had never left her own village? And what turned a girl who fainted at the sight of a butchered hog into a woman the soldiers of 3 baronies would later call the Widow of Thornwood? Before we get to the answers, there is a question worth sitting with. If it had been you in that cellar, in the dark, counting the days on the wall with your fingernail, what would you have become when the door finally opened? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Elena grew up the second of 4 children on a farmstead at the eastern edge of Thornwood Vale, in the shadow of a hill the villagers called Maiden's Rest, for reasons nobody could quite remember. Her father, a quiet man named Joseph, kept sheep and traded wool at the market 3 valleys over. Her mother, Ruth, was known for a temper that could silence a room and a laugh that could fill one twice as large. Elena was betrothed, in the loose way villages arrange such things, to a young blacksmith's apprentice named Peter, a boy with soot permanently under his nails and an earnestness that made the older women of the village smile whenever his name came up. Peter had asked Joseph for her hand that spring, and the wedding had been set, tentatively, for the following summer, once Peter had saved enough to build them a proper hearth of their own. She was not extraordinary. She was, by every account later gathered from neighbors and cousins and the priest who baptized her, simply a good and unremarkable girl, the kind history usually forgets. On market days, she walked the 3 miles into the village center with her younger sister, trading eggs and wool for salt and thread, stopping always at the same stall to let an old woman braid ribbons into her hair for a coin she rarely had to pay because the woman liked her too much to charge her. She sang badly and knew it, and sang anyway, while she worked the loom her mother had taught her on. She had never seen the sea, never traveled further than the market town 2 valleys over, and had told Peter more than once, half joking, that she intended to live her whole life within sight of Maiden's Rest, and die an old woman surrounded by grandchildren who thought her stories of the outside world were exaggerations. That summer, an old traveling peddler named Tomas, a widower who mended tools and shod horses for coin as he moved between villages, had passed through Thornwood twice, and both times he had mentioned, quietly and to only a few families, that 2 girls from a valley further west had gone missing that spring and never been found. Elena had heard the rumor secondhand from her younger sister and thought little of it, the way distant tragedy always feels smaller than it is until it arrives at your own door. Her mother, Ruth, had been more uneasy about it than she let on, and had taken to walking Elena partway to market herself that autumn, an overprotectiveness Elena teased her gently for, not yet understanding that her mother's instincts, that year, were sharper than anyone's. What made Elena different, in the end, was not something inside her waiting to be unlocked. It was what was done to her, and what she chose to do with what was left afterward. The company that called itself the Ashen Company had, by that autumn, become a quiet fear, passed between market stalls and church steps, across 3 lowland baronies. It was led by a lord's son named Alaric Voss, the second son of Baron Corvin Voss, a man whose title gave him just enough legitimacy to claim tribute, and just enough distance from his father's court to collect it however he pleased. 15 riders followed him, men his father's steward had once employed as border guards before Alaric convinced them there was more coin and more freedom in collecting from villages that had no soldiers of their own to refuse him. Word of their approach usually arrived a day or two ahead of the riders themselves, carried by fleeing peddlers or frightened shepherds who had seen the company's dust on some distant road. And Thornwood Vale had heard exactly this kind of warning 3 days before the riders finally appeared, though the village elder, Aldous, had insisted the warnings were exaggerated, that House Voss would never send men so far from its own borders over a harvest tribute nobody had ever legally owed. They arrived on a gray afternoon in the last week of the harvest, 15 riders in dull leather and iron, cresting the eastern ridge, just as the last wagons of grain were being brought in from the fields. And for a long, suspended moment, the entire village simply stood and watched them come, the way people watch weather they cannot yet be certain will actually reach them. Aldous met them in the square and argued that no tribute of the kind Alaric described had ever been owed to House Voss. For his trouble, Aldous was struck down in front of his own grandchildren, and the village that had spent all autumn hoping the rumors would pass them by, learned, in a single violent afternoon, that they would not. It was in the chaos that followed, as families scattered and men reached for pitchforks and hay scythes against swords and spears, that 2 of Alaric's riders found Elena outside her father's barn. She fought. Neighbors who watched from shuttered windows would later say she fought harder than anyone expected of her, that she broke a man's nose with the onion basket before they wrestled her down and bound her wrists. It did not matter. She was thrown across a saddle, and within the hour, Thornwood Vale was behind her, growing smaller against a sky the color of a healing bruise. Her father Joseph was cut down before nightfall, chasing the riders on foot with nothing but a hay scythe in his hands, refusing every neighbor's attempt to hold him back, including her own younger sister, who would carry the memory of trying and failing to stop him for the rest of her life. Peter arrived at the barn minutes too late to do anything but kneel in the mud where she had last stood, and would spend that entire first night walking the eastern ridge alone with a lantern, calling her name into hill country that gave nothing back but silence, and once, the distant sound of hoofbeats moving further away with every passing hour. By morning, the village had buried Aldous and Joseph both in the same small churchyard, and the priest who had baptized Elena as an infant found himself, that same week, offering a funeral rite for her as well, uncertain whether he was burying a memory or a girl who might, against every reasonable expectation, still be alive somewhere beyond the ridge. Ruth refused to allow it, insisting the priest save his rites for the dead they had actually recovered, a stubbornness the entire village would later credit as the first sign that the woman had not, in fact, given up hope, even as every rational voice around her insisted she should. She lived, but the village never heard her raise her voice in laughter again, and Elena disappeared into the hill country with the 15 men who had just taken everything she had ever known. What happened to Elena over the following months was pieced together only afterward, in fragments she gave to the very few people she ever trusted enough to tell, and in details that history has been careful and right not to dwell on. She was taken to an old hunting lodge the Ashen Company used as a winter base, built into the side of a limestone ridge 2 days' ride from Thornwood, a place so remote that even the wolves seemed to give it a wide path. She was not the only captive there. A widow named Cassia and a younger girl named Marin had already been held for weeks by the time Elena arrived, taken from a village further west during one of the Ashen Company's earlier raids that same summer. Cassia, having lost her husband to a fever the year before, and Marin having been taken straight from her own family's doorstep while walking home from evening prayers. Within a month, 2 more women were brought in from villages whose names Elena never learned, one of them a soft-spoken girl called Agnes, who had barely seen her 17th year. The men took turns keeping watch over the cellar where the women were held, and what they did to Elena in the months that followed was the same thing they had done to the others before her, over and over, for as long as it pleased them to do it. History does not need every detail of those rooms to understand what was taken from her there. She did not resist openly again after the first week. She learned, The way every captive in every century has learned that survival sometimes looks like stillness. She learned the names and habits of her captors, not because she wanted to understand them, but because she wanted, someday, to be able to identify every single one. There was Osric, who drank himself into a stupor most nights before the midnight watch. There was a man called Wren, who talked more than he ever raised a hand, filling the silence of the cellar with a nervous, endless chatter that Elena found almost more exhausting than the men who said nothing at all. There was Thane, a broad young soldier barely older than Peter, who flinched at the sight of blood despite wearing a sword, and who sometimes brought the women an extra blanket when no one else was watching. And there was Garrick, a quiet, heavy-set man who rarely spoke, and who, more than once that winter, seemed to forget to slide the cellar bolt fully into place when he was the one on watch. Whether out of carelessness or something closer to guilt, nobody would ever know for certain. By the time the frost had thickened into true winter, Elena had stopped counting the days on the cellar wall with her fingernail. She had started counting the men instead, memorizing, one by one, exactly what each of them looked like when they thought no one was paying attention, exactly which ones drank, which ones talked, which ones flinched, and which ones never showed a single flicker of anything human at all. There was a night, deep in that winter, when Cassia asked her quietly in the dark why she bothered remembering so much, when remembering only seemed to make the nights longer. Elena did not have a full answer for her then, only a certainty she could not yet explain, that a day was coming when all of it would matter, when every detail she forced herself to memorize in that cellar would become the only weapon she had left to use against the men who had taken everything else. Agnes, the youngest of them, grew weaker as the winter deepened, her body unable to recover between one ordeal and the next, and it was Agnes, more than anyone, who Elena promised, in whispered words traded across the cellar floor in the dead of night, that if any of them ever found a way out, they would not leave the others behind to face the spring alone. The night Elena escaped, only 6 of the 15 men were at the lodge. The rest had ridden out 3 days earlier to collect tribute from a village further south, leaving behind a skeleton watch that had grown lazy with the false safety of an unbroken winter. Garrick was on duty that night, and the cellar bolt, once again, had not been fully driven home. Whether he left it that way on purpose has been argued by every storyteller who has ever told this tale, and Elena herself, in the one account she gave many years later to a monk recording local histories, refused to say either way. What is known is that she did not run alone. Cassia and Marin went with her into the dark, though Agnes, too weak from the winter to travel, begged them to go without her and send help, rather than risk all 4 of them dying together on the ridge. Elena made her a promise before they left, kneeling beside her in the dark, long enough that Cassia had to pull her away by the arm, that she intended to keep no matter how long it took. They walked for 2 nights through hill country none of them knew, surviving on frozen berries and the kind of desperation that makes exhaustion feel almost irrelevant. Twice hearing hoofbeats in the distance and freezing in the underbrush until the sound passed, and once crossing a half-frozen stream that left Marin's boots soaked through for the remainder of the journey. By the second night, Cassia had begun to talk of simply lying down in the snow, a suggestion Elena refused to entertain even as her own legs threatened to give out beneath her, insisting they keep moving toward the thin trail of smoke they had spotted rising from a logging camp some hours before dusk. On the 3rd morning, half-frozen and barely able to stand, they were found not by soldiers or kind farmers, but by an old blacksmith and tool mender living alone at the edge of that camp, a widower who had served briefly, decades earlier, as a young man under a border company before trading his sword for a smith's hammer, and who had lost his own daughter to fever not long after, leaving him with an empty cabin and a quiet, unspoken hope, each winter since, that some stranger's child might need him enough to let him matter again. It was the same Tomas who had once passed through Thornwood with rumors of missing girls, and he recognized Elena, barely, beneath the frost and the hollow look in her eyes, the same look he remembered seeing in his own reflection the year his daughter died. He took the 3 women in, asked nothing of what had happened to them, because he had already guessed, and in the weeks that followed, gave them something none of them expected to be offered by anyone ever again. He gave them shelter, food, and, eventually, the means to defend themselves, and to go back for the woman they had left behind, teaching them, not out of any particular belief in vengeance, but simply because it seemed, to him, the only honest response left to offer three women the world had already failed once too often. While Elena, Cassia, and Marin were recovering in Tomas's cabin, the rest of the countryside was learning to be afraid of something it could not yet name. It began that spring with a single body found at a crossroads 2 valleys from Thornwood. The man had been a member of the Ashen Company, a rider named Bertrand, known for his cruelty and his fondness for cheap wine, who had been riding alone between villages when something, or someone, caught up with him. He had been killed cleanly, a single wound, and beside his body, driven into the frozen ground, was a length of iron chain, the exact kind used to bind captives in a cellar. Alaric Voss dismissed it at first as the work of a rival company. He stopped dismissing it after a second body was found 3 weeks later, a length of chain beside that one too, and then a third, and by then even his father's steward was asking questions Alaric had no honest answer for. The captain of the regional guard, a methodical man named Dorian Fell, was assigned to investigate, and for months he chased leads that led nowhere. He first suspected a rival mercenary band, known as the Grey Talons, rode 2 full days to their winter camp with a squad of 6 guardsmen and hauled 3 of their men in for questioning at the county garrison. He found nothing but alibis, indignation, and a captain who laughed in his face at the suggestion that his own company would waste good coin killing men who owed them nothing. Fell released them within the week, no closer to an answer than when he'd arrived, and privately noted in his own record that the Grey Talons' outrage had seemed, if anything, entirely genuine. He questioned jealous husbands next, disgruntled former soldiers who had once served under Baron Voss, even a hedge priest rumored to preach against the Ashen Company from his pulpit, and each lead dissolved the moment he examined it closely. What struck Fell most, as the months wore on, was the precision. Whoever was responsible knew the company's routes and rotations with an intimacy that no outsider should have possessed, timed each killing to moments when a man rode alone or a watch had thinned, and left behind no weapon, no witness, and no footprint that told him anything except that his quarry moved through the hill country like it belonged to them. On a routine visit to Thornwood Vale that spring, gathering statements from villages the company had passed through the previous autumn, Fell sat across a kitchen table from a woman named Ruth, Elena's mother, and asked the standard questions he asked in every household touched by the company's raids. Ruth answered plainly that her daughter had been taken the previous autumn and never recovered, that her husband had died trying to stop it, and that she held no hope left of ever seeing either of them again. Fell filed the statement beside a dozen similar entries from that same autumn's raids, thanked her for her time, and rode on to the next village, without once suspecting the connection sitting directly across the table from him. Inside House Voss itself, Baron Corvin Voss summoned his son that same spring after the third body was found, demanding to know what exactly Alaric had done to invite this kind of retribution onto the family name. Alaric insisted, as he would go on insisting for the rest of the year, that the killings were the work of a rival lord trying to weaken House Voss's standing through cowardly means rather than open challenge, and his father, wanting badly to believe him, let the matter rest for the time being, on the condition that Alaric bring the culprits to justice quietly and without further embarrassment to the family. It was a condition Alaric would spend the next year failing, with increasing desperation, to meet. Captain Fell's most thorough interrogation that year involved a stable hand who had once worked at the Limestone Lodge before quitting abruptly the previous winter. A young man Fell questioned for the better part of a day, certain the boy knew more than he was saying about who might have come and gone from that remote building undetected. The stable hand insisted, truthfully as it turned out, that he had quit only because the pay was poor and the men who employed him made him uneasy in ways he could never quite put into words, and Fell, despite 3 hours of careful, patient questioning, found no lie in him worth pursuing further. He left that interrogation more frustrated than any other, certain he had been close to something important, without ever managing to identify exactly what it was, a feeling that would follow him for the rest of the investigation and never fully resolve itself even after the case was formally closed. Inside the Ashen Company itself, the fear that had once belonged only to their victims began, slowly and unevenly, to change hands. Osric started drinking even more heavily than before, convinced the chains left beside each body were a curse rather than a message. Ren grew jumpy on night watch, talking faster and laughing less. Thane began refusing solo patrols altogether, a request Alaric mocked openly while privately assigning him fewer of them anyway. Alaric himself kept telling his men, and eventually his own father, the same story about a rival house moving against them through cowardly, indirect means, repeating it so often that by midsummer he had almost convinced himself it was true, right up until the fourth and fifth bodies were found within a week of each other, and the chains beside them made the truth harder to outrun than any lie he could invent. What Captain Fell did not know, and what Alaric Voss would not learn until it was far too late to matter, was that Elena had spent that spring becoming someone Thornwood Vale would not have recognized. Thomas trained her with a blade from sunrise until her arms shook, drawing on skills he had long since assumed he would carry to his grave unused, hung up alongside that old border company's colors the year he chose a smith's hammer over a sword instead. Cassia and Marin trained beside her, slower at first, their bodies still healing, but no less determined, and within months, 3 more women found their way to Tomas's cabin, each drawn by whispers, traveling through the hill country of a place where women were no longer expected to simply survive what had been done to them, and say nothing. There was Grace, a weaver's daughter whose younger sister had been taken from a village 2 valleys south the previous spring and never returned, who arrived at Tomas's door having walked 11 days on rumor alone, refusing to believe her sister was beyond finding until someone finally convinced her otherwise. There was Nora, a former soldier's widow in her 30s, older than the rest by a decade, who had lost both her husband and her home to a company much like the Ashen Riders when she was younger, and who brought to the group a discipline and a coldness under pressure that steadied the younger women more than once in the years that followed. And there was Hattie, barely older than Marin, who arrived at Tomas's door with nothing but a stolen kitchen knife and a fury that took months of careful, patient training to shape into something useful rather than reckless. A transformation Tomas himself later admitted took more patience than teaching any of the others combined. By early summer, there were 6 of them, and it was Marin, one night around a low fire, who gave the group its name, saying that they had all been hollowed out once by the same kind of men, and that now, the only thing left inside any of them was the blade. Elena led them not because she demanded it, but because the others simply followed the calm, exacting focus in the way she moved and planned every decision they made. Their first mission was not a killing at all. It was the promise Elena had made in the cellar months before, and in early spring, the 6 of them returned to the lodge on the limestone ridge to find it nearly empty, its remaining guard, a frightened young man who turned out to be Thane, fleeing into the trees, rather than raise his sword against 6 armed women he barely recognized as the same captives he had once pitied. Agnes was still alive, barely, and the hollow blades carried her out of that cellar themselves, delivering her to a healer in a nearby town where she would, over the following year, slowly recover a life of her own, far from Thornwood and far from the Ashen Company both. Only after Agnes was safe did the 6 of them turn to the list Elena had memorized in the dark that winter, and even then, not without disagreement. Hattie argued more than once, and often loudly, that mercy for men like these was a weakness they could not afford to indulge, while Nora, who had buried a husband to men just as violent, argued the opposite, that becoming killers without limits would cost them something they could never earn back, no matter how justified each individual death might feel in the moment. Elena settled it the only way she knew how, insisting that each target be tracked and confirmed beyond doubt before any blade was drawn, that no innocent bystander ever be harmed in the process, and that the choice of when and whether to show mercy would always belong to her alone, a rule the others accepted, if not always comfortably. It was a rule that would be tested only once, and it would be tested by Garrick. Osric was the second to die, found in early summer behind the tavern where he had been drinking himself insensible nearly every night since Bertrand's death, killed so quietly that the innkeeper did not notice until morning, a length of chain left across his open palm, as though someone had wanted him, even in death, to finally understand what he had spent a winter refusing to feel guilty for. The Hollow Blades had watched him for nearly a month before that night, learning his routine down to the hour, and it was Cassia who argued for taking him first, since it had been Osric's watch, more than any other man's, that had made the cellar feel most unbearable to her during the weeks she had spent there before Elena ever arrived. Ren went next, tracked for nearly 3 weeks as he moved between garrisons, talking his way into the confidence of every guard captain he met with the same restless, ingratiating charm he had once used on cold nights at the lodge, the kind of talk that had always struck Elena as a man trying to fill a silence he was afraid of. Elena herself, disguised as a traveling merchant's wife, cornered him alone on a forest road one evening and let him talk exactly long enough to say every name of every woman he remembered from that cellar, watching the color drain from his face as he slowly understood who he was speaking to, before the conversation ended the same way all the others had. Thane, who had fled the lodge rather than fight the women he once pitied, was found 3 months later hiding in a monastery under a false name, having convinced the brothers there that he was fleeing a debt rather than a reckoning. It was Nora who tracked him down, and Nora who, after a long and unusually quiet conversation the other Hollow Blades never fully heard the details of, chose to end it anyway, unwilling to let one act of cowardice at the lodge erase a winter of silence in the face of everything he had watched happen and done nothing to stop. Halden and Corwin, 2 riders who had transferred to a garrison further south after the killings began, convinced that distance from Thornwood meant safety from whatever was hunting them, were found within a day of each other that autumn. Halden on a hunting trail he had walked alone against his own captain's orders, and Corwin inside a locked barracks room that no one could later explain how anyone had entered without being seen. Piers, the largest and cruelest of the remaining company, put up the fiercest fight of any of them, cornered at last in a stable yard where he had gone to saddle his horse for what he did not know would be the final ride of his life, wounding Marin badly enough across the forearm that she carried the scar for the rest of her life before Elena finished what Marin's blade had started, driving him back against the stable wall until his sword finally fell from a hand too exhausted to hold it any longer. By the second autumn since her escape, the pace of the hunt quickened, and 4 more names fell in quick succession, each death now carrying a kind of grim inevitability that even the Ashen Company's remaining men had begun to accept as their likely fate. Godwin was taken at a river crossing while attempting to flee the region entirely, caught wading into the current with his boots still in his hands. Wistan never left his own barracks bed, killed so silently that the man sleeping in the cot beside him did not wake until morning. Edric died on the road between 2 garrisons that no longer trusted each other enough to travel together, having volunteered for the journey precisely because he believed a public road in daylight was the one place the Hollow Blades would never strike, a belief that cost him the last mistake he would ever make. Talbot, the last of that wave, was killed within sight of the manor walls he had believed would finally keep him safe, cut down at the edge of the tree line, close enough to see the torches of the guards, who might have saved him had anyone thought to look in his direction in time. Each death carried the same signature, a single clean wound and a length of chain left in plain sight, until the countryside stopped calling it the work of a rival lord or a jealous husband and started calling it, in hushed voices around market stalls and church steps, simply the reckoning. Only Soren remained of the 12, a quiet, aging rider who had said little and done much over the years, and who Elena tracked alone to a border crossing where he had hoped to disappear into a neighboring kingdom entirely, having sold what little he owned and left before dawn without a word to anyone still loyal to House Voss. He never made it across. By the time his body was found, tucked into the reeds beside the crossing with the same length of chain resting against his chest, Captain Dorian Fell had stopped filing his reports as the work of an unknown vigilante and started, in the privacy of his own conscience, wondering whether some crimes deserved the reckoning they were finally receiving, a thought he never once wrote down and never once spoke aloud to his superiors, though it shaped every report he filed for the rest of that year. Fell came closer to the truth that year than he ever realized. Following a tip after Wiston's death, he rode 2 days to a logging camp on the strength of a rumor about a blacksmith who had once shod horses for a company of women passing through, and arrived at Tomas's cabin only 3 days after the Hollow Blades themselves had departed for their next target, finding nothing but cold ash in the forge and a swept dirt floor that told him someone had lived there recently and left in a hurry. He questioned Tomas himself twice more that year, without ever suspecting the old blacksmith's true role in everything he was investigating. And Tomas answered each question with the same unhurried honesty he offered everyone, careful never to lie outright, only to let the captain's own assumptions do the work of misdirection for him. Fell would later admit, in that same letter to his sister, that some part of him had always suspected he was being allowed to get close and no closer, and that he had, in the end, stopped minding. By the time news of the fourth and fifth deaths had spread, the story of the reckoning had stopped belonging only to Captain Fell's official reports and started belonging to the countryside itself, passed from farmhouse to farmhouse the way the best and most dangerous stories always travel, faster than any rider and twice as hard to stop. Mothers in villages the Ashen Company had never even reached began telling their daughters a version of the tale that had already begun to drift from fact toward folklore, of women who moved through the hill country like smoke, striking only at men who deserved it and vanishing before any soldier could so much as raise an alarm. Innkeepers reported travelers swearing they had glimpsed 6 riders on a distant ridge at dusk, though no two descriptions ever matched, and more than one tavern song was composed that year, giving the hollow blades names and faces the real women themselves would not have recognized. What the legend understood in its own exaggerated way was something Captain Fell's careful investigation never quite let itself say aloud, that an entire region had been terrorized for years by men nobody with real power had ever bothered to stop, and that whoever was finally stopping them had earned, whether the law approved or not, exactly the kind of quiet loyalty that no reward offered by House Voss could ever hope to outbid. Farmers who might once have reported strange riders to the nearest garrison instead said nothing, again and again, across more villages than Alaric ever managed to count. And it was this silence, more than any blade, that ultimately protected the hollow blades long enough to finish what they had started. By the following autumn, only 3 of the original 15 remained alive, exactly as the countryside's whispers had begun to predict. Alaric Voss, chief among them, holed up in his father's fortified manor with the last of his men, having finally understood that he was not being hunted by a rival or a curse, but by the very woman he had once thrown across a saddle without a second thought. He doubled his guard, hired mercenaries from outside the region at a cost that strained even his father's patience, and offered a reward for information leading to the hollow blades that no farmer or hunter in 3 baronies ever claimed, because by then, the countryside had made its own quiet decision about which side of this story it stood on. He stopped sleeping in his own chamber, moving instead between rooms each night, so that no one, not even his own steward, could say for certain where he would be found, a habit his father mocked openly as cowardice, and privately understood as something closer to a man who had finally realized exactly what he deserved and could no longer outrun the knowledge of it. Garrick, the man who may or may not have left a cellar door unbolted out of guilt, was among the last 3, and it was Garrick that Elena chose to approach first, alone, unarmed, on a night when he stood watch at the edge of the manor grounds, having volunteered for that post more often than any other guard, as though some part of him had been waiting the entire time for exactly this conversation to finally happen. What passed between them that night has never been fully recorded, but Garrick was found the next morning alive, badly shaken but alive, the only man among the 15 the hollow blades ever chose to spare. Some say Elena recognized in him the one flicker of conscience the others never showed. Others say she simply wanted at least one of them left standing to carry the story forward, honestly, in his own words, long after she and the others were gone, so that history would not have to rely only on Captain Fell's careful reports and a captured lord's self-serving lies. Rurik, the third and last of Alaric's inner circle, was killed 2 nights later at the manor gate. Caught alone during a change of watch he had insisted on taking himself after growing suspicious of every other guard around him, a suspicion that proved justified in every way except the one that might have saved his life. His death finally forced Alaric to accept that hiring more men would not save him from 6 women who had spent nearly 2 years learning exactly how he moved, exactly how he thought, and exactly how much he feared the dark now that the roles between hunter and hunted had fully reversed. He wrote a letter to his father that night, one historians would later find among Baron Voss's private papers, admitting for the first time in writing that the killings were no rival's doing, and asking, without quite finding the courage to say the word forgiveness, whether there was any path left that did not end the way he already suspected it would. The hollow blades came for the manor itself 3 nights after Rurik's death, moving through the outer wall in the same silence they had used at the lodge nearly 2 years before, slipping past mercenaries who had been hired to guard against soldiers and bandits and had never once trained to watch for 6 women moving through their own blind spots. In the fighting that followed, brief and almost entirely without witnesses willing to speak of it afterward, Alaric Voss was killed by Elena's own hand, in the same cellar-dark hour of night that had once defined the worst months of her life, cornered finally in the same private chamber he had moved into and out of for months, trying to outrun exactly this moment. It is said, though never confirmed by any surviving account, that the last thing he heard before the end was his own name, spoken quietly by the woman he had never once bothered to learn the name of when he took her from her father's barn 2 years before. Captain Dorian Fell arrived at the manor the following dawn to find the last of the Ashen Company dead, the gate standing open, and no trace of the women who had, by then, already vanished back into the hill country they knew better than any soldier in his command ever would. He walked the length of the manor grounds himself, before allowing his men to begin their own search, and it was there, alone, that he found the last length of chain, left this time not beside a body, but simply resting on the manor steps, as though whoever left it had wanted him, specifically, to understand that the reckoning had finally run its course. He closed the case, officially, as the work of an unknown vigilante group, and privately, in a letter to his own sister that historians would only discover centuries later, he wrote that he had chosen not to look too hard for women the entire countryside seemed determined to protect, a quiet act of mercy from a man whose entire career had been built on the opposite instinct, and one he never once regretted in the years that followed. Garrick lived out his years in a distant province under a different name, and it is said, though never confirmed, that he sent a portion of his earnings each year to a farmstead near Thornwood Vale, addressed to no one in particular, though the villagers who received it always seemed to know exactly where it belonged and never once asked who had sent it. The other 5 hollow blades scattered quietly across the lowland baronies in the years that followed, each carrying the weight of that year differently. Cassia remarried and raised 3 children in a river town 200 miles from Thornwood, never once speaking of the winter that had brought her and Elena together, though her eldest daughter would later say her mother kept an old length of chain in a locked drawer for the rest of her life, and never explained why. Marin, the scar from Pierce's blade never fully fading, became a healer herself, training under the same woman who had nursed Agnes back to health, as though determined to spend the rest of her life repairing what men like the Ashen Company had spent a season destroying. Grace and Nora stayed together, running a modest inn along a trade road for nearly 30 years, where travelers passing through sometimes swore the older of the 2 women watched every new arrival with an attention that seemed, somehow, too practiced to be simple hospitality. Hattie, the youngest, eventually joined a company of her own, one that answered only to villages too poor to afford real protection, and old enough by then to understand exactly why Elena had insisted, all those years earlier, that mercy remain a choice and never a weakness, a lesson she reportedly passed on to every young woman who ever trained under her in turn. Agnes, the girl the entire mission had begun with, lived a long and quiet life in a coastal town none of the others ever visited again, and it is said she kept, for the rest of her days, a small wooden carving Tomas had given her the week she arrived at his cabin, too weak to stand on her own. Elena did not return to Thornwood Vale, though word reached her, years later, that Peter had waited 2 full seasons before finally accepting that she was not coming back, and had gone on, eventually, to marry and raise a family of his own in a neighboring valley, a fact she received not with bitterness, but with something closer to relief, grateful that at least one person from her old life had been allowed to simply move forward. Her mother, Ruth, lived out her remaining years on the same farmstead outside Thornwood Vale, and though the 2 women reportedly exchanged letters through a trusted courier for the rest of Ruth's life, They are believed to have seen each other in person only twice more, both times in secret, both times, according to the courier who carried the letters, ending in tears that had nothing to do with sorrow. What remains of this story today survives mostly in fragments, in a monk's recorded history compiled nearly 40 years after the events themselves, drawn from interviews with aging villagers who had once known Elena or Ruth or Peter, and were, by then, willing to finally speak of what they remembered, in a captain's private letters preserved by his family long after his death. And in the folk songs that grew up around the hill country long after everyone involved had died, each version slightly different, each one certain of details the others contradicted, the way every story worth remembering eventually becomes something closer to legend than record. It raises a question that has never fully settled in the centuries since. Elena was never tried, never punished, and never, by any surviving account, regretful. Whether that makes her story one of justice finally served, or something far more complicated, depends entirely on which part of it you choose to sit with longest. Was the law failing her the reason she had to become her own judge, or does what she did afterward complicate the sympathy her suffering deserves? Would you have recognized the danger riding into your own village that afternoon, and if you had survived what she survived, do you believe you would have walked away from that cellar the same person? Or would you have walked out looking for the same 12 men, and then the next 3 after that? Let us know in the comments what you think really happened between Elena and Garrick that night at the manor wall, and whether you believe her story ends where the history books stop recording it. If this story moved you, stay close, because our next story might be even harder to look away from. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next true tale we bring you from the shadows of history.